right, good morning, and welcome to our Campolo Scholars Forum. Thank you for all being here in person, and we have some online. I know I've heard from some others that are going to be showing up a little bit late, but we're delighted to be able to join together in person, as well as having people join us online. My name is Robert Gaudier. I'm the Executive Director of Development for the Campolo Center for Ministry. I have the privilege of working with our students and colleagues and helping support and prepare students for ministry. Looking forward to this morning, glad you're here. I want to briefly thank everybody who gave for the Day of Giving campaign and the challenge. We were able to reach our goal of 25 gifts for the Campolo Center, which unlocked a $5,000 gift for Eastern, which was divided among some other programs, including the Campolo Center. So I'm grateful for all the students and friends of the center that supported that effort. And thank you for that and helping us to raise the resources to support students in the future. Next Monday, we will be all virtual because our guest, Wendy Ryan, who's an alum who came to Eastern because of Tony, she will be joining us from South Africa. She runs Evangeline Ministries, which is a microeconomic development program and ministry. She will join us and share about her experience at Eastern, the impact of Tony, and what the kind of ministry she's doing in South Africa to help raise up women and families out of poverty, using the Bible for literacy. And she's dynamic, amazing woman. So I hope you can join us online for that. We will send out announcements to remind you of that meeting. Because today's topic is really heavy, I want to reserve as much time for our guest, Reverend Mark Moore, as possible. Mark is an alum. He did his bachelor's degree in 1977. He completed his Master's of Divinity at what was then called Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary in 1980, and then a Master's of Arts in Religion in 1981. So he's paid his dues in the classroom, and from there he went on to serve as a pastor of numerous churches. So he has the pastoral in the Methodist Church experience, a variety of churches, but he's also spent time serving as a chaplain in the military. And he's worked for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in DC. So he is very acquainted with the life, military life, and the toll it can take on soldiers who go into conflict. And so we're delighted to have him join us today. Because last week we had Dr. Reggie Williams in. He's a Bonhoeffer scholar. He was in for the Campolo Scholars Forum and the Missions Forum. And he was talking about the life, theology, the Christian ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who spent a year in Harlem and was transformed by that experience, went back to Germany and was active in the resistance to the Hitler and the Nazi regime, and it ultimately cost him his life. So we're sort of in the wake of that heavy conversation about what it means to be Christian in the face of that kind of evil. We're also very aware of the conflict in Ukraine and the war that's taking place there, and other war and conflict and violence that's taking place around the world. And so we as Christians do have to wrestle with these real issues that face humanity. And I'm really pleased and thankful to you, Mark, for coming to join us and to help us wrestle with and think through not only the practical issues of how you would even begin to serve as a chaplain in the military. One of our Campolo scholars happens to be pursuing chaplaincy, but also the moral and ethical dilemmas or issues that we have to wrestle with and be supportive about as for folks that are in the military. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Mark Moore. And thank you for being here.
Good morning. We have some here in the chapel with us, and to all those visiting online. I wish I had a whole week to talk about all the stuff going on right now. We're going to have to compress it into an hour. So what I'd like to do first is just give you a quick overview of, one, how does one become a military chaplain, if that's, do you feel that's your calling? What's involved with that? What are the requirements? And then what are the roles and functions of a chaplain? And then I'd like to take the last half, whatever it's going to be. And again, feel free to make this a Q&A, an engagement of questions. I am not the final answer on anything, believe me, and be interested to hear from you. And if you want to, I really want this to be a dialogue. Okay, so if anybody here, just wave your hand, shout out, and anybody online, wave your hand, whatever, and I will try to call on you. Just a quick side note, I am joined today by 3 guests, one a pastor friend of mine, who we've been friends for, goodness, 35 years, Mel. One, my sister, who happens to be in from Anchorage, Alaska, and who's also an alum of Eastern. And the only non-alum, my son, Dustin. Just coincidentally, I was a huge, Bonhoeffer was a huge influence in my own theological development. And when we were picking his name out, if it had been up to me, his name would have been Dietrich. I lost that battle. So we're glad to have, like I said, my sister from Alaska, my son, and my good friend Mel. Okay, real quick, I just want to walk through, again, what about, what is military chaplain? First off, I have to give kind of a standard disclaimer. I am speaking only for myself. I do not speak for the Department of Defense or the Air Force or any other governmental agency. And in all honesty, like I said, I've actually been retired from the military since 2009. So some things have changed, but at the same time, a lot of the foundational things remain the same. Let's start. Where's the beginning of military chaplaincy? It actually starts with the First Amendment of the Constitution, which, just so I get it right, I wrote down, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I'm sure all of you in some point in civics class or American government or whatever learned that line or heard that line. There are some who said, well, isn't the military chaplaincy a violation of the First Amendment? Because my tax dollars are supporting, chaplains of all different faith groups. And the answer is, you're right. However, the courts over the years have recognized that we are kind of a carve out to that. And that literally goes back to, well, interestingly enough, here we are sitting in Radnor, Valley Forge, just a few miles away. Very first military chaplain was put on a payroll by George Washington when he was encamped at Valley Forge. So there's a long history. And some of the history goes that when, if you're a sailor on a ship at sea, if you're at some very remote outpost, whether that's here in the continental United States or overseas, you may not have the opportunity to exercise your faith and practice the rites and rituals of your faith. So there have been a number of court challenges over the years, but pretty much the courts have said, you're kind of a carve out, we have to make an exception. All services have chaplains. Now when I say all services, what I mean by that is the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. There are no Marine chaplains. The Marines are part of the Department of the Navy, and so all the chaplains who serve in the Marine Corps are in fact Navy chaplains, and who are then, their current assignment is to somebody, some unit in the Marines. And the same is with the Coast Guard. Coast Guard is an interesting thing because it's kind of neither fish nor fowl. It is a military operation, but it is not under the authority of the Department of Defense. Which actually makes it some very interesting legal things, depending on the time we may have opportunity to talk about that. But all Coast Guard chaplains, again, are Navy chaplains who are assigned to serve in the Coast Guard, the coasties, as we call them there. Okay, if you decide, hey, I'm interested in becoming a military chaplain, And what I did, I just Googled and did a cut and paste. All of the services are very similar. I just did a cut and paste from the Army. Let me walk through this and make a few comments. To become Army chaplain requirements, again, this is on their website, are not older than 42 by the date they are commissioned into the Army. They have completed their basic theological education for their denomination or faith tradition. Typically, it's the MDiv, but again, some faith traditions have, something different than that MDiv, but it has to be at least a 72-hour master's program. And of course, that's based on you already have your bachelor's degree. Have completed at least 2 years post-theological education, professional experience in their denomination or faith tradition. Now, that's only for active duty. Okay, which means what? You just can't walk out of seminary, go down and try to become a chaplain. No, they want you to have had 2 years experience in whatever, in my tradition, we call it a pastoral role, so that you have some background. You're not just starting fresh. You've had some experience already. You are ordained or endorsed by their denomination or faith tradition to serve in the components of the Army. I'll get into more detail on that in just a minute. Religious endorsement, what that means, I just can't walk, I've got my bachelor's degree, I've got my, MDiv, and I've been serving in a congregation or in some form of professional ministerial capacity for 2 years. I just can't go down to my recruiting office and say, hey, I want to be a chaplain. First, what has to happen is I have to be certified, endorsed, they use different languages sometimes, by an existing faith-based organization. Okay. And again, one of the things anybody in the military chaplaincy runs from is any legal issues, which you can't believe how many legal issues have come up over the years. Years ago, they tried to recruit military chaplains based on the United States Census. And if the country was, and I'm going to make some numbers up here, 22% Roman Catholic, they tried to have 22% Roman Catholic priests. If it was 18% Southern Baptist, you wanted to have 18% Southern Baptist, et cetera, et cetera. The problem was folks in independent faith, in those days, primarily the evangelical traditions, said, hey, we're not big enough to score on, the national census. So they had to throw that out and they went to best qualified, which I'll get into. But what it has to be, when you become a military chaplain, I'm a United Methodist pastor, retired, thank you, Jesus. You have to be certified or endorsed by that denomination, saying that you have met not only their theological requirements and their educational training requirements. Here's what it says. You must obtain ecclesiastical endorsement from your faith group. This endorsement should certify that you are, one, a clergy person in your denomination or faith group, qualified spiritually, morally, intellectually, and emotionally to serve as a chaplain in the Army. This is from the Army site, for all military personnel, their families, and civilians who work for the Army. One of the real challenges that we have is you have to be willing to work in a very pluralistic environment. This is especially true. I first went in and entered the chaplain candidate program in 1979. The world has changed since 1979, and perhaps nothing has changed more in America, aside from cell phones and computers and stuff, has been the picture of faith. I'm a classic baby boomer. I got up every Sunday morning and station wagon pulled out of our driveway at 9:15 every Sunday morning on our way to church. If I had gone through my third grade classroom and there's 25 kids in the classroom, I could go around and say, there's Bobby, he attends, the Catholic church. There's Susie, she attends the Episcopal church. And I could go around and name every child in my classroom. And maybe they only go on Christmas and Easter, but every one of them would have had some faith affiliation. The last church I served full time in Thorndale, you may have heard of the Paoli Thorndale Lions, where I was. Literally 500 feet down the road was an elementary school, Callan Elementary. If I'd gone into a typical third grade classroom, with 25 students there, I would be surprised if half of them have ever even been inside a church. And of those half of those, they attended grandma's funeral or their cousin's wedding or, a baptism. And again, maybe 7 or 8 regularly attend any sort of, ongoing faith tradition, worship, Sunday school, youth group, what have you. And so as the American culture around religion has changed, the chaplaincies had to try to figure that out. But no matter what, when you're a chaplain, I started the bulk of my career, I did 15 years at Dover Air Force Base. I was not just a chaplain to the Methodists. I was not just a chaplain to the Protestants. I was not just a chaplain to the Christians. I was the chaplain for everybody in the 512th Airlift Wing, whether they were people of faith, people of no faith. And I was there to meet their needs. They were not there to meet my needs. Now, here's where a rub comes in. If I was preaching a chapel service, I was free to preach whatever I wanted to preach. Again, as long as it was not, defaming another faith group or something like that. When my Roman Catholic brothers would have Mass, they would consecrate the Eucharist in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We used to joke that our Southern Baptists, they would preach about Jesus. Okay. And again, when you are in a chapel, when you're conducting a Bible study, what have you, you are free to practice your own faith traditions. However, there are other events that chaplains are invited to participate in. Sometimes we have what's called a command-directed activity. This may be, the commander of a given unit wants everybody to gather. He or she wants to share what's going on, what the challenges are, what's coming up, what have you. It may be the squadron picnic, or the wing Christmas party, what have you. And typically they would say, hey, Padre, would you offer an invocation? Now, these are command directed, which means everybody had to be there. That's a military order. So when you are in that type of an activity, you are asked to be sensitive to the fact that there are people of many different faith traditions and compose your invocation or whatever it's going to be in a way that's as inclusive as you can possibly be. Over the years, and I'm just going to say it like it is, some of our very, very conservative evangelical brethren, they were all brethren at that point, said, you're denying me the right to pray in the name of Jesus. So we're saying, no, we're not denying you anything. We're asking you to be sensitive. And some literally went to court over this. Sometimes you have events that are not command directed, but are command sponsored. It may be a promotion party, a change of command. And same thing. It's not command directed, but good chance you're going to have a lot of people there. They ask you to be sensitive to the fact that not everybody in the room is Christian. And some people would insist on, I have to put in the name of Jesus or the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, whatever at the end. And inevitably somebody would file a complaint. And quite frankly, what happened is the chaplains marginalized themselves because the commanders say, I've got real issues to deal with. I've got our mission. Are we ready to actually execute our mission if needed? I've got retention issues. I've got recruitment issues. I've got budget issues. You fill in the blank. So I don't need this stuff over here. So chaplain, I'm no longer going to be asking you to do an invocation. And so these chaplains ended up marginalizing themselves. Again, you are never, we have the same free exercise of religion as anybody else, but we're asking you in a pluralistic environment to please be sensitive to the needs of all the people, because you're the chaplain of all the people. So anyway, so I have to be certified by my denomination, which for me, many years ago now, it's almost like going through an ordination process all over again. I had to get everything from a physical to a mental health exam. I had to submit transcripts. I had to submit page after page after page of theological reflections. And of course, one of the first questions they're always going to ask is, how can you work in a pluralistic environment? You're going to have Christians, you're going to have Jews, you're going to have non-Christian, you're going to have people with no faith. I don't think I met a Muslim until I was out of high school, probably out of college. the Islamic faith is very active in our part of the world today. Driving in from my little Chester County village today, I passed a Hindu temple. I guarantee you 50 years ago, there were no Hindu temples in Chester County, but there are today. So again, how are we going to be sensitive and support the religious and spiritual needs of all people, regardless of their faith tradition? Okay, so assuming you go through that and your denomination supports you, and by the way, to avoid any legal challenges, what they kind of decided on as the lowest common denominator is if you're a faith-based nonprofit recognized by the IRS, then you count. But you just can't go file papers tomorrow and say, I want to be the first church of Bob or the first church of Susie, whatever. And no, you have to be part of a recognized faith community. Then you go through the endorsement process. Then you're going to go through the selection process. Let me just continue a little bit on the roles and responsibilities. I don't know, what's my time here? This is, again, cut and paste from the Air Force website. Responsibilities: providing pastoral care, ministry, and counseling to those of faith and those of no faith. Air Force chaplains are religious ministry professionals who support the spiritual resilience of our airmen all over the world. As spiritual leaders, chaplains are relied upon for faith and personal guidance. They're also advocates for airmen and consult with leadership on moral, ethical, and quality of life issues. So again, you are going to be doing a lot. When you're coming in as a chaplain, 99% of your responsibilities are basically going to be the same as if, in my case, I were in a Methodist parish. The only cool thing about being in the Air Force, if I was a pastor and showed up at one of my parishioners' places of employment, I probably wouldn't be welcome. Why? Time is money. And if I'm talking to my parishioner, that parishioner is not generating, whatever it is they generate for XYZ company. In the military, chaplains are expected to be out and about. We are welcome everywhere on a base. So my funnest days, quite frankly, as a young chaplain, I would do ride-alongs with the security police. I drove bulldozers with the engineers. I used to go flying all the time. The air crews had to get their certain number of hours in. I would go flying with them. It was fun, okay? But as you move up in rank, your responsibilities change from just providing the daily pastoral care and sort of thing into more of the leadership and management and advising the senior military leadership. So by the time, for example, I worked at the Pentagon, I was on the staff of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I don't want that to sound too impressive. He had a staff of 1,200. Okay. I was on his personal staff, which meant I was one of 100 on his personal staff. But we were in the Office of Religious Affairs, and we would advise the chairman and all other people on the influence of religion on military activities. Why do we have to think about that? I'll speak for myself. I was raised in America, liberal Jeffersonian democracy, separation of church and state. Most of the world doesn't think that way, okay? Religion and state, in many cases in the military, go hand in hand. And when we didn't understand that, we stepped in piles of stuff that caused a lot of problems. We did this, again, it's now 20 years ago it started in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because we didn't understand the culture, the religion, and oftentimes, particularly in these kind of more tribal areas, the tribal leader, who's the political leader, is also the military leader, is also the religious leader of the community. So whereas we separate the religious leadership, they were fully integrated. And again, if our leaders didn't understand that, it caused all kinds of problems, and they didn't understand that. So for example, one of my jobs, I was activated for 5.5 years after 9/11. We would write training exercises for Joint Task Force commanders, usually a 3-star general or admiral. And I don't want to bore you with details. We had what was called the MESL, the Master Event Scenario List, which meant we were going to run these exercises. It was basically in a giant computer network center. And we would put pop-ups in dealing with all the things theoretically that a commander could face. And it was my job to put religious challenges in there so that a commander would at least understand I have to consider the role of religion, and hopefully have a chaplain that I can say, tell me about this religion. What's the significance of this religious holiday? You know, and across the world, you know, then you run into things about gender issues and all the other things that, you know, you deal with. So again, the more you rose up in rank, the less you dealt with the day-to-day. I didn't go flying with the air crews anymore. I didn't do ride-alongs with the cops. I didn't drive bulldozers with the engineers. I sat in meetings. I wrote point papers. I spent hours and hours on research so that I could help people going into these environments understand. Okay, a couple quick more things, and then like I said, I really, really want to open it up to some give and take, Q&A, whatever. All of the services have a chaplain candidate program. They all vary slightly. These programs are essentially opportunities for seminarians who are considering a career in the military chaplaincy, basically to do an internship. Again, you still have to go through a screening process, both with your denomination or your faith group and the military. But if you're accepted, you then, you know, I was an Air Force chaplain candidate. I did 3-month-long summer tours at 3 different Air Force bases. I was in training. So I didn't do a lot of direct hands-on stuff. I kind of shadowed somebody. But again, they let me preach in the chapel. I mean, I've been a pastor for a couple of years. They let me run some Bible studies, things like that. Again, just as anybody would on any internship in almost any career field. So if anybody's interested, that's a good place to start. One of the things we talk about is ministry of presence. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes the most important thing a chaplain can do is just be present. Let me give you an example. I worked at Dover Air Force Base for 15 years. C-5s, those huge planes, well, now they have C-17s too. They were considered a vital national resource. So no one was permitted on the flight line without, you know, proper authority. I had to have a special badge. And all around, and of course, this literally probably ran for a total of 10 miles and all, you know, they would have guard shacks. Well, who gets to stand midnight watch in a guard shack on the backside of an Air Force base? Is some 19-year-old kid who's away from home for the first time. You know, they just finished basic, they went through whatever training, and now they're assigned, and now they've drawn the short straw. And so they're at a guard shack on the backside of the base. You know how creepy it is when you're a 19-year-old kid to be in the backside of an Air Force base, and you've been trained that bad guys are going to come. So we had permission to do this. We'd go out, and we'd have in the winter we'd have jugs of lemonade or iced tea and some cookies. In the winter we would have hot cocoa, tea, coffee, and just go out and say, "How's it going, guys? How's things out here?" You talk for 5 or 10 minutes. They don't remember a word you said. What they're going to remember, they're going to remember you cared enough to come out. I remember having a long conversation with one of the Air Force chief of chaplains. This is a 2-star general, okay? And he would, you know, he travels, they're on the road all the time visiting bases. And he would land, and of course, the highest ranking officer on the base would always meet him, welcome him, you know, and they'd want to take him to the club for a fancy schmancy dinner. Chaplain Baldwin was his name, and great guy. And he would say, as soon as I got off the plane, take me, this is over in Iraq and Afghanistan, take me to the bomb dump. The bomb dump, as it's affectionately named, is the farthest spot on base where they store all the munitions. Why? In case something happens, they don't blow up the whole base. Well, as you can imagine, these are heavily guarded. Who are they guarded by? 19-year-old kids. He would go there and says, "When was the last time your chaplain saw you?" And he said, that's all I needed to know about the chaplain. If the chaplains are only hanging out with the brass and enjoying dinner at the club all the time, they're not doing their job. He wanted to make sure all those airmen all around the base, you know, doing the worst jobs, were getting visited by their chaplain. Just a little moral support. Sometimes you say, "Hey, chaplain, you know, while you're here, we talk for a couple minutes." You'd end up in some fascinating conversations. Other folks just like, "Well, thanks for stopping by, chaplain. I appreciate a cup of coffee." Great. Again, we're here to meet their needs. They're not here to meet our needs. So ministry of presence is a big thing. One of the biggest challenges we have, like I said, years ago, they got rid of the census data. So when they did that, they went to best qualified candidates. Best qualified candidates. Here's the problem with that. On paper, and I'm just going to lay it out like it is, the best qualified candidates, 9 out of 10 times, were white men from very evangelical traditions who were 26 or 27 years old. Okay, they had just finished seminary, finished the minimum requirements, and again, now they wanted to become chaplains, which is great, but that didn't meet the other end of that continuum, the needs of the service. Do we have Roman Catholic priests? We jokingly, and I'm one of them, they call us the baby baptizers. Do you have Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, what have you, who will baptize babies? Because of course our more Baptist friends, and I know I'm speaking Baptist institution here, don't baptize babies. Well, a lot of the people don't or come from a background where they want that. The challenges has only grown greater, again, as fewer and fewer young people in my own denomination. We have virtually no, what we call elders in full connection. That's a fully ordained person. We have virtually nobody under 35. Virtually nobody under 35. So the pool for Methodists, for Presbyterians, for Episcopalians, it's a very small pool. We want to be racially diverse. We want to be, theologically diverse. We want to be diverse in every way. And we live with this tension between the best qualified, because often the best qualified, like you say, were 26, 27-year-old white Southern Baptist men. But we want to make sure we have women. We want to make sure we have people of color. We want to make sure you fill in the blank. And we lived with this tension all the time. So my very last job was, I was at the headquarters of Air Force Reserve Command. And basically we were the screening for anybody wanting to come into chaplaincy. So we asked a very specific list of questions, which had been vetted by legal to make sure we weren't violating anybody's constitutional rights. Because again, we want best qualified, and we have to try to get a diverse force to meet the needs of the service. Again, in the military, just a couple quick things to go over, and I really want to, definitely got to open it up here. There are both active duty and reserve components. Active duty is exactly what it sounds like. You're going to go on active duty, whatever service you're assigned to. You're going to be assigned to, X base, or if you're in the Navy, you're going to be assigned to, a destroyer squadron, what have you. And it's the initially you sign like a 4-year contract, but at some point they say, okay, we like you, you like us. Let's have you plan to stay for at least 20 years. And you do. Whereas in the reserve components, you have active duty, you have reservist and National Guard. They're not the same thing. National Guard, when they're not mobilized, they're under the authority of the state governor. Okay, with the exception of Washington, D.C. You may remember a little thing called January 6th. Okay, why was the National Guard not called out? Because Washington, D.C. doesn't have a governor, so who is responsible for calling him out? Well, that'll be the president. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, I'll let you fill in the blanks. And so under law, under federal law, the military cannot act in a policing capacity. We do not have policing authority to go into the streets, except under extreme circumstances, okay? When you're in the National Guard, you work for the governor, you can. So that's why typically when there's, a riot or something like that, they have policing authority. Now, they also, of course, help with, disaster recovery, if there's a fire, if there's a flood, an earthquake somewhere, what have you. They're all subject to being recalled to active duty. So again, I was a reservist. After 9/11, my phone rang, and soon, for the next 5.5 years, I was on extended active duty. I already mentioned that chaplain's free speech is not denied when we ask you, in my case, not to pray in the name of Jesus or the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because I just need to be sensitive to the needs of all the persons that I'm addressing. largely since I retired 13 years ago, but a number of other things where chaplains have become quite involved. This is not an exhaustive list. This is an indicative list. Suicide prevention. We are often the first person somebody will talk to. Why? Because if I go talk to my commander, the commander has to file a report on that. That goes in my file. You know, if I go see the mental health clinic, they have to put that in my file. In a chaplaincy, everything you say to a chaplain is considered confidential. One exception in the Army can break confidence if somebody walks in and says, I'm going to go kill my commander. Why? Because Army guys carry guns. Vast number of Air Force guys don't carry guns. So we were often the first line of defense for someone contemplating suicide. Now, we could then handle it to the level of our training, and they have been providing more and more training. And all the services run active CPE, where a service member, a chaplain will go to XYZ hospital and do a year of CPE, or they'll send them to get a master's in mental health, what have you. But also to know your limitations and know when you need to get the mental health authorities involved, what have you. So that's become a big thing, particularly over the last, well, I'll say 20 years at this point. Sexual violence. Again, Google sexual violence in the military. And in 2 seconds, you're going to come up with 17 million hits, okay? Again, who might be the first person a victim of sexual violence comes to? It's going to be the chaplain, okay? Now, typically, they're going to encourage that person to report it through the chain of command, and they're going to work very hard to make sure that person is protected against retaliation. Does it work perfectly? We all know the answer to that, but that's something. Racism. The military has an interesting history. On the one hand, believe it or not, the military was actually a kind of progressive force at some point in American history. Go back into the late 1940s when Harry Truman was the president. He integrated the military. Did that go over well with everybody? What do you think? Do we still find racism in the military ranks? Of course. Why? Because we're a microcosm. The military is a microcosm of society. However, they do run a lot of, training. We're all in this together. You have to rely on the person on your left, the person on your right, and so to try to work down, some of the things on racism. One of the big things, again, particularly the last 15, 20 years, this kind of goes along with some of the other things, is reducing the stigma around mental health. I have seen 4-star generals and admirals publicly say, I'm suffering from PTSD. I'm going to go see, my psychiatrist, what have you. Because, in the service was always kind of that macho culture, suck it up, get there. So the services collectively, and often with the chaplains, kind of leading the front because we're uniquely positioned to do that, to destigmatize people seeing a mental health professional. One or two quick last things. A chaplain will never be asked to violate his or her personal faith or his or her personal theological convictions or their faith traditions. So as a Methodist minister, I could not do the High Holy Day service for a Jewish community. I would either try to find a rabbi, military rabbi, or we would often, because there's such a shortage in some of these, what we call high demand, low density fields, we would go out into the community and we would hire a rabbi. We would hire Catholic priests. We would hire Orthodox priests, put them on contract. We tried where possible to get military chaplains who are retired. We couldn't always do that. But again, our job is the best we can to meet the needs of everybody who's entitled to our services. And if that means we didn't have the resources, we're going to look outside the gates to get them. That was kind of my talking points for today. So far, let's see, we've got about 20 minutes left. Anybody in the room or online have any questions or comments? Or have I bored you so totally you've all zoned out? Anybody? Bueller? Youngsters won't get that. Ask your parents, they'll understand that joke for you. Yes, ma'am.
I like when you speak, you don't call it radical hospitality, but it seems like that's what you're doing. Is faith-based service but you're not, as you say, you're there to serve
Yes,
people, they're not. So you open it up to like this radical idea of hospitality where you're willing to be changed.
exactly. Yeah, and there's sometimes we would take that a step further. I'm thinking back, and again, this is long before most people watching today, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I was working at Dover Air Force Base. This is 90 and 91. We had hundreds of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. We were kind of the staging area because they'd get there and then they'd get on a plane and fly to the Middle East, whatever. And so sometimes they'd be sitting around for 4 or 5 days. We would open up the chapel and we'd have movie nights. You know, we'd just rent a movie. And we'd have pizza and coffee and what have you to give the, you know, because again, oftentimes these are very young service members away from home for the first time. And now they're going into a potential violent situation. And so we wanted to give them something to do, quite frankly, other than sit around and get drunk at night. You know, so we tried to do something positive by having movie nights. We'd have, you know, in cooperation with other agencies on the base, we'd sponsor softball games, basketball games, just, you know, kind of the healthy activities that they could do. Yes, I would put it, as Bishop Shanese talked about, radical hospitality. We're trying to make these folks feel as comfortable as they could. And again, and, you know, suddenly, maybe somebody who hasn't darkened the door of a church in 10 years, but now they're getting ready to go in the combat zone, they may just want to talk to their pastor, priest, rabbi, imam, what have you. And we always try to make ourselves available for that. An interesting sideline, and this caused some fuss with, again, some of my more conservative brothers and sisters. The Defense Logistics Agency, they're actually the ones that buy all the supplies that we get. They put together a packet of laminated prayer cards for many different Christian denominations, for, you know, for our Jewish friends, for our Muslim friends, for our Hindu friends. Why? Because they're going to send them overseas with the chaplains who are on the front line. Because if soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, whatever, is just shot and is laying there bleeding, waiting to be evacuated, you may want somebody to come and pray with you. I'm a Christian pastor, so if I have a Muslim guy shot, I'm probably not going to say, let's say the Lord's Prayer together or something. So they would literally put in cards so that everybody could, you know, have some sense of, this is my faith tradition and we want to respect that. Did some chaplains have a problem with that? Yes, they did. Typically, those chaplains don't last long. You have to be able to, willing to fully embrace working in that type of a pluralistic, multi-faith or no faith environment. Other questions, and we'll switch gears. Yes.
Thinking of what you were speaking of with some of the more maybe fundamentalist people in the chaplaincy, we've all heard a lot in the news about the radicalization of the military, how maybe a disproportionate number of the January 6th rioters were either military
Or veterans.
Retired. Did you see much of that, or do you hear much of that? And how is the chaplaincy trying to deal with it?
I'll be honest, I didn't see much of that during my days. But again, we're a microcosm of society. And again, there are certain elements of society that are attracted to kind of the macho professions, the military, policing, what have you. I know what they do today, you know, they try to address it. And they're saying, hey, if, you know, and again, each of the services has a very different culture. Okay, the Marines have the most distinctive culture. Why? Number one, it's the smallest force. I think they only have around 200,000. Number two, they're the first ones hitting the beach. Okay, in the Marine Corps, the philosophy is every man's a rifleman. Every Marine Corps person goes through basic rifle training, and everything else in the Marine Corps is built on supporting the guy with the rifle hitting the beach. And when you're hitting the rifle at the beach, I have to count on my battle buddies. So, you know, I may have some racism or some, you know, whatever, you put your whatever you want in front of it. But my life may depend on how my little squadron gets along. And when you're out in the field like that, suddenly you discover, gee, my African-American friend, he's a really great guy. He has the same problem I do. My Jewish friend, he has the same problems at home that I do, you know, or whatever. you try to deal with it. You try to deal with it on the institutional level as best you can. That's at the higher ups. And on the base level, you just try to run life in such a way that, people accept each other. But again, the military is a microcosm society that also has a historic penchant for getting people with kind of the macho, and sometimes they would bring that extreme racism. There is extensive efforts now. There's actually been some things go to court, that somebody in the Air Force, let's make this up, is a member of the Oath Keepers. You can't penalize a person for their beliefs. Now, if they go out and participate in some violent demonstration, now we're going to get rid of you. I can't penalize you for your beliefs. I can penalize you for your behavior. So if you're in one of these fringe radical groups, and it's a cat and mouse game. The more you try to find them, the more they kind of go underground. Our only hope is that, whatever influence, I'll speak from the chaplain's perspective, whatever influence we have, we call them towards acceptance, understanding. And I don't like the word tolerance. I tolerate you. No, I want to embrace you. Does everybody share that view? Of course not. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question was kind of like really extreme conditions. Did you find people were more willing to talk about their faith?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The question was, in extreme conditions, were people more willing to talk about their faith? And again, I've never served in a combat zone. I sent people to combat zones. I designed the training programs for people in combat zones. And I was there when they came back. So when you've seen, let me just change the topic just slightly. We've all been aware of physical injuries, okay? We've become more aware of mental health injuries, PTSD and things like that. We've actually come up with a new category we gave a name to, moral injury. Moral injury, y'all familiar, anybody, a couple of you familiar with the concept of moral injury? Real briefly, it's you've had to do something that violates your conscience, but you may have had to do it to save your life or the life of your friend. An example, long recognized that there are certain sites that are off limits for military activity. Schools, hospitals, houses of worship. Have you all seen the papers in the last week? How's that going around the world? So for example, during Iraq and Afghanistan, they would have situations where there would be a mosque. That's off limits, except a group of snipers set some things up with some RPGs. And there's a convoy coming through. So here's a person with a rifle or whatever, and the commander said, that mosque right there, they've got 10 RPGs in it, there's a convoy coming through, you've got to take them out. Well, the problem is there might be 50 people worshiping on the first floor. But to save your life and the life of your friends, you now fire your weapon to take out that mosque, and maybe 50 people die. You've got that ethical dilemma faced there. And now people are going, I was always taught you don't mess with houses of worship. Sometimes it was a family coming up in a car to the checkpoint, and the soldiers trying to stop them, and they're coming through. You've got seconds to decide, is this car an IED, improvised explosive device? Or is this just a family trying to escape violence? You've got seconds to make that decision. And if you make the wrong decision, you might get blown up, or you might kill a family who's just trying to escape violence. And then you go, how many times does that soldier with that rifle wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning screaming, stop, stop, stop. And now he sees images of dead kids. So are they willing to talk to chaplains when they've been in those situations? Yeah. Just a couple of minutes left. I want to switch gears. And as Robert, referred to in the opening, here we are in this situation now where, just in Ukraine, and we realize there's many other violent spots around the world. Ukraine obviously has the headlines right now. What is the Christian role in violence? And you have the full spectrum. I live out in just a few miles east of Lancaster County. I live in Chester County. Most of my neighbors are Amish farmers. They're pacifists. I also live not far from, people who would, they're pretty sure Jesus is an American. And if you were to hear today, he'd have an AK-47 on his side. Okay. Where do we come down on that? This is my personal perspective. Like I said, I as a young student, was heavily influenced by teacher Bonhoeffer. And I kind of adopted his philosophy. In fact, I looked it up just before I came in here. One of my favorite Bonhoeffer quotes. Hopefully my phone's still working, right? Hello, phone. Here was Bonhoeffer, and this was done in the context, if you've ever read Bonhoeffer, he was invited to, again, I would have loved to have heard some of the lectures last week. I just couldn't make them. To participate in the plot to assassinate him. And he really wrestled with that because as a Christ follower, he was against violence, but we're seeing millions of people slaughtered. So what do you do? Here's his famous quote. We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself, which was his way of saying, I'm going to do whatever I can to stop this. And if that means taking up arms, I take up arms. If that means having to kill somebody to save, whether it's in Bonhoeffer's case, the Jews in the concentration camps, or today children in, and we get we'll just use Ukraine because it's in the news, children in a school in Ukraine, then I will do it. That's my personal perspective. I hate violence. I loathe violence. I try to be a Sermon on the Mount person, but I live in a real world. I live in a real world where in my time, 20 years ago, people hijacked planes, crashed them into buildings, and killed 3,000 people just going about their daily business. I live in a world now where, and yet you can put Syria, you can put Sudan, you can put any number of other names in here, where sometimes tough ethical decisions are called for. You can go back and read just war theory and all that. One of the big questions is, I know I'm running just for no time here. As a country, when should we get involved? That's always a challenging question. I remember during the Clinton era, Clinton said his biggest regret as president was he did not get involved in Rwanda much earlier. If you remember, was it 94, I think it was in Rwanda, where 800,000 people were slaughtered. And he said, if I could go back, I would change that decision. Now, one of the questions you ask is, why is something like this in the national interest? We're not threatened militarily. They're not going to destroy our economy. Sometimes the national interest is a moral and humanitarian. And we say, we cannot sit idly by and watch innocent people get slaughtered. We have to do something. Every person who calls himself a Christ follower, you have to make that decision for yourself.